I've received a lot of reports from students who took the LSAT earlier today that the logic games were unusually hard on today's LSAT, that LSAC is looking to go out with a bang, with the June LSAT being the last one to ever feature the logic games section. Today, I'll walk through these claims and share my thoughts on how likely they are to be true. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005. Back when I was studying for it, logic games started off as my worst section. They ended up being my favorite section, and I've done every single released logic game dozens of times. And one thing I've seen over the course of my career is that students complain after every single official LSAT that this test was different. It had unusually harder logic games or logical reasoning or reading comp. Thing is, these logic games on today's LSAT were all tested prior to be standardized in difficulty, and it would undermine the legitimacy of the LSAT if LSAC were to suddenly do something crazy. That being said, of course, some logic game sections and some errors of logic games are harder than others, but whenever this happens, they are balanced out by easier logical reasoning and reading comp to compensate. Looking back on it, of course, Prep Test 31's logic game section, this is the one with the CDs game featured in Legally Blonde. That section and that game in particular were, of course, notoriously difficult, and the logic games in the prep tests numbered in the 30s were harder than average overall. Then in prep tests in the 40s, logic games were easier than average. Whenever this happens, of course, again, there's a balance, harder games, easier reasoning, easier reading comp, just to kind of even things out. So I've been hearing these kinds of complaints from students for long enough that I'm pretty skeptical that the games today were unusually difficult, that they were anything crazy. If anything, during a transitional period like we have now, with the change to the test starting in August, with their removing logic games, LSAC is pretty likely to minimize changes to the test overall because the format change alone is stress-inducing enough. My guess here is that it's probably just the adrenaline and the stress of the real thing making these test takers today feel like the logic game section was unusually difficult or radically different in any way. If you were to do these games on a practice test during your regular studying, they would probably seem to be nothing different than anything else. Of course, I have not seen these games myself. They have not been released. They probably won't ever be released because, of course, the format of the test is changing. But my guess, just based on experience, that these reports are probably just due to the stress of the real thing coloring perceptions. However, there is one change I am expecting beginning in August that isn't just going to be stressed out test takers. And by the way, if you're taking the LSAT in August or beyond, and you'd like my help scoring 170 or above, you can check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. So here's the change I'm expecting to the LSAT starting in August. LSAT may be testing more quantitative reasoning in the logical reasoning section beginning in August. The reason I think this is that over the past 6 months or so, going all the way back to November actually, I've gotten countless reports from test takers that the logical reasoning experimental sections in November and January and February and April contained more questions involving formal logic, numbers versus percentages, absolute versus relative values. Of course, LSAC won't be able to test these concepts in the logic game section anymore because there won't be a logic game section anymore starting in August. So it could be that they'll test this in logical reasoning instead. This is not going to be some radical new question type, and LSAC themselves denies that they're making any radical changes to the test other than removing games and replacing it with a second score logical reasoning section. And I understand why. It's because this is not going to be a new question type. It's not even going to be a new concept they're testing. It'll just be an increased relative proportion of these questions in the logical reasoning section that have already appeared on previous exams. So make sure to brush up on these if you're taking the LSAT in August and beyond. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.